Welcome to the introduction of T is for Trauma. My name is David O'Connor, and in this episode, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and some of my story, why I chose to do this podcast, and what you can expect from future episodes. So, to start with who I am, I was born and raised in Ireland. I moved to the US in 2014, and I now live in Austin, Texas. I have spent much of my career in the tech industry, with occasional stints as a professional poker player, an investor, and a consultant. But these details are somewhat secondary right now. What is important is the story of why I'm launching the podcast on this day, July 28th. And I chose this date because it has special significance for me. I say that because on this day, 2 years ago, my whole life changed. Now, to first give you some background on what my life was like before this day 2 years ago, I'll say that I am somebody who has done a lot of therapy, roughly 10 years now. I first started therapy because I wanted to dig into the general sense of disconnection and unhappiness that had been pretty much a constant through much of my teens and 20s. But overall, for me, therapy was a very frustrating experience. While I did find it somewhat helpful in allowing me to better understand and navigate some of my issues, I felt like I wasn't really making much progress, despite being very dedicated to the process. The recurring visual I would have was that I was standing on a frozen lake, and I could see this deep, dark water beneath the surface, but I just could not break through the thick sheet of ice that stood between myself and it. I really wanted to go deeper in my work, I just couldn't, whether that was because of something mental or something physical. Then, about 5 years ago, I began to look into the research surrounding psychedelic therapies, and in particular, MDMA therapy. These therapies allowed people to go deeper in their introspection, and many people found it instrumental in allowing them to have the breakthrough they needed to move forward with their inner work. And so it was on this day 2 years ago that I participated in my first session of MDMA therapy. For those of you not familiar with it, MDMA is an empathogen, which allows you to experience the feelings and emotions associated with painful memories and to re-examine past traumas through a non-judgmental, compassionate lens, much more so than is generally possible through traditional talk therapy. Sessions usually last between 4 and 6 hours and are done in a quiet room with a facilitator, who is often a licensed therapist. The participant takes a small dose of MDMA and then puts on noise-canceling headphones and an eye mask to block out as much external stimuli as possible. Honestly, going into my first session, I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for. I just knew that I wanted to go deeper in my work and get a better understanding of myself. That first session lasted about 4 hours, and I would say that for the first 3 of those hours, things were pretty run-of-the-mill. Mostly it focused on prior relationships or unresolved feelings towards past conflicts. But as the session went on, there was an ominous sense of foreshadowing building in the background. Then, right around the 3-hour mark, I had the stark realization that I had repressed a memory of being molested by a relative when I was 6 years old. In that moment, I could suddenly remember the distress, the terror, and the confusion that I felt, as well as the distinct smell of cigarettes close to my face. It was truly shocking. This realization was life-altering for me because I had spent more than 30 years without a conscious memory of this event. In the weeks and months that followed this revelation, things were emotionally very difficult. On top of the sadness and anger and betrayal that I felt, I was also forced to re-examine my own personal development through this new lens and start to connect with the deep problems I had faced for much of my life around shame, low self-esteem, and intimacy, which was very challenging. But I was determined to confront this head-on, and I made a commitment to see this process through to the end. And so, in addition to my regular weekly talk therapy practice, I continue to do MDMA therapy, and in these last 2 years, I've done a total of 7 sessions. Unfortunately, with each subsequent session, the number of incidents of sexual abuse that I became consciously aware of continued to grow. And with it, the number of abusers also increased until a horrific pattern of abuse between the ages of 3 and 12 emerged. This was a very harrowing process, and the amount of healing work required to get through all of this seemed just insurmountable. Ultimately, I took a sabbatical from my career at the start of 2022 in order to focus on this work. Now, my whole life, I've had a somewhat obsessive personality, and one of the upsides of this is that it allows me to hyper-focus on things. When I latch onto something, I'm able to go deep down the rabbit hole with it until I feel like I know everything I need to know about it. And so, during this time, trauma became my new obsession, and I started to consume everything I could get my hands on that would help me understand this experience. I read The Body Keeps the Score, The Drama of the Gifted Child, the works of Peter Levine and Gabor Mate, everything and anything I could get my hands on. What I found was that many of these books were good at explaining trauma and its mechanisms in a very clinical, abstract sense, but they just did not describe experiences that I found to be relatable or accessible. This was a very isolating experience for me, and I felt very alone in this process. However, as I started to share my own experiences of trauma with others, I found that many people were open to sharing about their own past traumas. They just needed to know that it was a safe place for them to share and that the other person could understand their experience. I also came to realize that many of the podcasts I already gravitated towards and consumed on a regular basis were what I would consider trauma adjacent, where trauma is not necessarily the central theme of the show, but it is often a topic of conversation or a consistent trend among the guests of the show. In particular, these guests were typically comedians who often have significant childhood trauma, or veterans who often experience their trauma as adults in the form of PTSD and other issues. Because of this, I feel like people are ready to have these conversations, and I want this podcast to be the place where that happens. My hope for this podcast is that it provides a platform for conversations that facilitate healing, and in doing that, helps heal myself, heal my guests, and heal my listeners. While this first episode is a solo endeavor, my plan is for the podcast to be mostly interview-based, with sporadic solo episodes sprinkled in to riff on different topics. The show is not actually about me or my trauma. While I'm the host and my experiences serve as the backdrop against which people can show up, the show is about healing from trauma. The basic outline of every episode will be asking guests to share with us what happened to them, how it affected them, and how they found healing from it. I will also be interviewing therapists and other experts in this space to better understand the benefits and challenges of working through trauma, as well as the emerging research that is being integrated into modern modalities. The podcast is not about telling a sad story or a guest blaming somebody else for all the bad things in their life. It's about the healing, and it's about the journey along the way. Broadly speaking, everybody either has trauma or knows somebody who has trauma. And my hope for this podcast is that my audience gains a better and kinder understanding for what that experience is like. I hope you'll join me on this journey and that it brings both healing and understanding to anybody who is suffering. Thank you.